as far as our family was concerned, my father was able to make ends meet, and we were reasonably comfortable. It certainly wasn't a time that people could become rich, but there were families who felt it was very hard to live during the Depression years. Yes, my grandfather and his father before him actually were in the painting and decorating business, and they managed to keep in reasonably constant employment. When they went from one job to another, their ladders and paint pots and paint mixing mill, which they used in those days, they mixed their own paint. They didn't buy it ready mixed. That gear was taken by a hired horse and cart to the next job, and if the job was close handy, my grandfather would get back home on his bicycle, which he also put on the horse and cart. But if it was further away, well, there were the trains and cable trams. In fact, I can recall walking from Ascot Vale over to Footscray Tech on an open day. This was in the evening, and having a look at all the things that went on in the technical school. But that would be around about 1930. Oh, it was interesting, and they had. They didn't show much of the classroom side of it, but things like the foundry where they melted up brass and so forth, and turned it into various shapes, and miniature engines and generators. I first went to a school in West Footscray and rode my bike there, and I think we were paid something like £96 a year for the privilege of working, and we were given small classes of I think a maximum of 25 was the rule, and you sort of went through 2 or 3 years of that before you then entered Teachers' College or whatever. I did have it in mind to go in for industrial chemistry, but I was put off that idea by one or two people who said, "Oh, you'll probably spend most of your life washing bottles." So I didn't think it was a good idea. I couldn't see myself remaining a primary teacher for the rest of my life, and another student teacher who was at the same school, he had the idea to do a couple of science subjects in the evening, and so I started my university studies part-time that way. I think the first subject was called natural philosophy, one which is another name for physics, and also did some mathematics and geology. With those subjects, there was a minimum of practical work, but that could be done in the evening or on Saturday morning. At Essendon High, I was more or less a contemporary of Jim MacDonald, who was working in the office there, and I think there are one or two teachers there who lived around Ascot Vale. A chap by the name of Ben Willis, who was on the trade side, and another chap by the name of Sedgley, who taught instrumental drawing there. And the principal at that time was Joe Aberdeen, who I think only lasted 2 or 3 years before he died. And that might have been about 51, and that's when Howard Beanland came in. I think compared with the secondary education and the tertiary level, you were more or less left to your own devices, and if you wanted to work, you did. If those that didn't want to work, well, they didn't pass. But there was not the same pressure put on you as in the high school. But I know at high school I did Latin for quite a few years, and I don't know why, but the person I had teaching there, he later became a politician who started the Democratic Labour Party, old Frank McManus, and my impression of him as a teacher is one of the laziest teachers you could ever imagine. But however, yes, the sports grounds down below Farnsworth Avenue, as it was then, and the surveying equipment for that was stored at the Ballarat Road School in the basement of, I think it was called A Block, and later shifted up further into one of the trade blocks further along that sort of internal road that went along there. Most of the lectures took place at Nicholson Street. Part of the course was to produce a 20-acre survey and do the surveying work with what were called chains, which were long steel bands for doing the accurate measurement, and the metallic tapes or linen tapes to do the offset or side measurements. And then having done that, which took a few days, the students had to produce a plan of that on a large piece of drawing paper, generally parchment. I think they called it a double elephant size. But it's interesting that the examiner, they had external examiners in these subjects, and the examiner was an ex-Footscray student, Ron Page. We did, I think about 3 or 4 excursions during the year, and they were always well written up in the school magazines because of the so-called hardships they had to go through on these excursions. It was something very different to their classroom activities, and they, we went on to such places as Werribee Gorge or Royal Park. Coburg was another standard area, Broadmeadows, up the Maribyrnong Valley, that was another one, and you talk to the students about the landforms in the area, and they made sketches or took photos and made notes, and then they put together a report on it all. They did such things as modelling plant leaves and so forth in clay, and then there was what they call rule perspective, pastel drawing, that sort of thing. I remember one of the teachers, the modelling teacher, he had been there since the beginning of the school, a chap by the name of Moody, and the other teacher was a chap by the name of Sefton. I don't know how long he had been there, but that was. I managed to do 2 years' work in one because through attending classes I automatically qualified for a pass in that subject, and I just sat for subjects for the other year, and they weren't terribly difficult academically to get through. That was my introduction to Footscray Tech. Yes, he was developing the school. He was more interested in the diploma side of it, because there was a junior school there as well. And he suggested that I go to Footscray and see what was happening there, because the principal, Arch Hoadley, who took the surveying, died, I think, in 1947. And that's how I finished up teaching that subject at Footscray, and also geology. I think somebody was taking the geology in the meantime, but so I inherited those subjects. He was, I'd say he was very efficient, but a bit standoffish, and the staff were just there to work. He was more interested in getting industry and outside people into the act, and you know, a different personality. I know the only time he called me by my first name was in the last year I was at the place. Otherwise I was Mr. White. I would say none at all. Mostly local boys, although at that time there were two waves of other students coming into it. We had the ex-servicemen under the Commonwealth Reconstruction Training Scheme who were endeavouring to complete a diploma, and also students under the Colombo plan from Indonesia. And I remember the Commonwealth Reconstruction Training Scheme, they were all right if the lectures were in the morning. If not, they probably had a very good lunch over at the Belgravia and spent the afternoon going to sleep. I don't know about the Indonesians. They seem to spend a lot of their spare time driving taxis and doing such things. I suppose. They came. I think I had them mainly in chemistry classes, and they were quite well they're quite all right. I think they put a special stamp on their papers so that they weren't marked quite as hard as some of the other. I had one student doing chemistry. He came, I think, from the Preston area. That was Ron Barassi, and I don't know that he completed a diploma, but I had him at I think it was Form 5 or 6 for a chemistry class, and I remember him. In the first lecture, you get them to fill in their full names, so forth, and this chap, he was always in the back row, and he was always pleasant and always wearing an overcoat and always munching a meat pie if it was after the morning recess, and this chap wrote his name down as Ronald Dale Barassi. I wondered what the devil was going on, because my first two names are Ronald Dale. I thought he was trying to make a monkey out of me. But pleasant, and he was, he was quite good. But as I say, he'd always. He'd get in on time, but he'd always go for the back row as far away from me as he could. On the whole, they were quite a pleasant lot. I dare say I tried to make my teaching as painless as possible, and sort of identify them and identify with them, and put in a few jokes where applicable. There there are a few I taught who later became teachers in technical schools. I remember I taught Ian Ray. I think he went on to bigger and better things later on.